To build a payment plan template, go to Templates, Payment Plans. You may see a few examples already in your account. To create something new, click Create New Template. First, give your template a name by clicking the pencil icon next to the title at the top. You can always update the title at any time by clicking on the pencil icon. Next, begin setting up your template by adding the amount of installments you would like your payment plan to consist of. Click into the installment to define the due date and the amount due for this installment. This is also where you can pre-schedule canned emails to go out before or after the due date. If needed, you can add additional installments on this same plan, or you can stick to just one installment if the entire amount is due in full. Let's create a payment plan together that will set up an invoice total into 3 equal installments. The first installment, for 1/3 of the grand total, will be due immediately. The second installment, for another third of the grand total, will be due 1 month later, and the final installment will be due 1 month after the second installment. We'll walk through this specific scenario together, but I will cover additional options at the same time, including a relative due date, a fixed due date, or TBD, and dividing installments equally, a percentage amount, or a fixed amount. The first step in setting up this template is to add 3 installments to the payment plan. For each installment due date, we have a choice between a relative due date, a fixed due date, or TBD. If we click on Relative, it allows the payment plan to calculate the exact due date for you based on certain project milestones the client reaches. It will adapt the timing automatically when you apply this payment plan to an invoice within a project. There are 6 options for triggers: before and after project start date, before and after project end date, after payment plan applied to invoice, and after contract signed by client. The before and after project date triggers will calculate based on the official project date and work best for projects with a defined project date. That means if we set the relative due date to 30 days before project start date, this installment would be due 30 days before whatever date is set as the project date. Likewise, if we set this to 2 weeks after project end date, the installment would be due 2 weeks after the project date. Next is after payment plan applied to invoice. This trigger will calculate from the date that the payment plan was originally applied to the invoice and will work well in a variety of situations, especially with recurring invoices. The last trigger, after contract signed by client, will wait to calculate a due date until after the contract on the project has been signed. If you're using a proposal, contract, and invoice combination, this is a good trigger to use for the first installment. For a fixed due date, we can choose a specific date on the calendar. This option may come in handy if you're creating a payment plan inside of a specific client's project. But since we're working on a master template that we can use on multiple projects, a fixed date is not the best option here. A TBD due date allows you to set an open due date for this particular installment within the template, but gives the business owner the ability to manually set a specific due date later once the plan is applied to an invoice. This option may come in handy for business owners who don't know when a payment will be due because it's based on a work-related milestone. In our example, the first installment is due immediately, so let's choose 0 days after payment plan applied to invoice for our relative due date. Here's a tip. It's not common to use a fixed due date in a payment plan master template. The only reason to do so is if you're setting something up for a specific holiday offer or event. Next up is setting the amount due. The three options here are divide equally, percentage, and fixed. The first option is divide equally. This option for amount due will set up equally divided installments automatically based on how many installments you have on your payment plan. It's also the default for installments in new payment plans. If you go with a percentage amount, you want to account for 100% of the invoice over all of your installments. This percentage can either be distributed over multiple installments, like 50% on the first due date and 50% on the second due date, or 100% due in full by one date. A fixed amount would be just that, an exact dollar amount. This is a good choice if you always require a $500 deposit no matter what the invoice total is. In our example of 3 equal installments, the easiest way to split up the installments is to make sure divide equally is selected for each of the 3 installments. Once you've entered the due dates for each installment, you're all set. We'll circle back to setting up the payment reminders in an upcoming video. Tip number 1. Use divide equally whenever possible. It's the most flexible option, especially if you think you'll be changing your invoice line items during the duration of your project. Tip number 2. You will run into trouble if the sum of your percentage installments exceeds 100%, like if you had 3 installments for 50% each. Let's take a look at a different example with a deposit. This time, $500 will be due immediately after the contract has been signed, and the remaining balance will be due 30 days before the project date. In this payment plan, the first due date will be 0 days after contract is signed, indicating that the deposit is due up front when the client books. For the amount, let's enter a fixed amount of $500. In this scenario, the entire remaining balance will be due 30 days before the project date, so we can simply add a divide equally installment after the initial $500 is due, and the payment plan will automatically calculate the remainder of the invoice. Our last example requires payment in full up front, so the entire balance will be due immediately after the contract is signed. To do this, we simply set the installment to divide equally, then choose a relative due date. This is a great payment plan template to have on hand. Even if you are not dividing the invoice into installments, you'll still want to use a payment plan since the payment plan defines when an invoice is due. Tip number 3. If you do not add a payment plan to your invoice, there is technically no due date, so Dubsado is not able to recognize whether a payment is late. Tip number 4. When you use payment plans, you'll be able to see a list of any overdue invoices on your Dubsado dashboard or under reporting.